Alan, over to you.
Well, first of all, I must say personally to Chris a very fulsome thank you for that very kind and generous introduction. I'm almost reminded irresistibly of an introduction I gave to the late Tony Cornell, who was a distinguished psychical researcher from Cambridge at a meeting of the Ghost Club in 1997. Where I listed a whole load of things, and he just interrupted and said, "Don't overdo it," which I think that must also be my perspective, at least in light of some of the things I'm going to say, because I'm not really going to talk so much about my own experiences, but really things that have shaped in this fascinating subject, in which we connect up with an experience which is truly universal. The whole subject of ghosts, life after death, the survival of human personality and consciousness is one which has gripped societies thousands of years before ourselves, one which is obsessed and interested every human culture of which we have any record. So whatever we say, whatever I've got to say, is merely just a small scintilla in that enormous flow of human experience, thought, and comprehension over many millennia. And whatever I say tonight to you certainly isn't in any way to be treated as the definitive last word. It never could be. A few insights which I've gained in the subject of ghosts, apparitions, poltergeists, hauntings, these kind of things, which are some of the essential business of ASSAP, which I've gathered in one form or another over the last, I realised with a degree of horror, 45 years. I'm getting terribly old, I realise. I've been around an awfully long time, at least in terms of having a serious interest in the subject. And I'm going to take you into some slides so you don't have to suffer a talking head for too long. So let's see if I can share my screen successfully, and
Alan,
hopefully you're now getting a picture on a screen, which is potentially called Alan Murdie Reflections on Ghost Hunting. Is there anybody there who can confirm this?
Yep.
You can. Thank you.
It's really
Thank you very much indeed. Good. Right. Well, let's go into my own experiences for a start. What have I got to show after 45 years of serious interest in ghosts and the paranormal? It amounts to one apparition, ghostly noises I've heard probably on 2 or 3 occasions, object movements I can't explain, poltergeist type activity on 6 occasions, possibly 1 or 2 ghostly smells, and strange atmospheres or temperature drops on numerous occasions, just in the course of visiting haunted sites, allegedly haunted places, and so on. But strange to say, it's not my own experiences that ultimately convince me. If I'm asked the question, what makes me think this is a worthwhile subject, this is something that deserves serious scrutiny from intelligent minds, and more intelligent minds than mine, it's the striking similarity you find throughout human history in similar experiences to these, many miles apart, many centuries apart. I'm convinced, not on personally what's happened to me. I could be wrong. I could have suffered all kinds of delusions. Who knows? but it's the striking similarity you find stretched across cultures which convinces me. Now, if I ask myself what started me getting seriously interested in the subject, well, it was coming across this book, Our Haunted Kingdom, at the age of 11. Now, I had been, as many children are, and I think it may well be a phase that they go through, where they're equally obsessed with dinosaurs or something similar at an early age. Well, I was interested in ghosts and ghost stories. And in 1975, I went into the library in Bury St Edmunds, and I was keen on finding out a bit more about ghosts, and I was very lucky to draw this book off the shelves. Written in 1973 by Andrew Green, who was one of Britain's most active ghost hunters, it set out to be a comprehensive study of Great Britain and Ireland in terms of hauntings, genuine experiences reported within the previous 25 years. That's Andrew Green. There he is looking at a book he wrote back in 1973, the world's first popular ghost hunting guide, one which really has been the inspiration of ASSAP and many other individuals, many other organisations over the years. I think it's fair to say that Andrew Green more or less invented modern ghost hunting from a purely scientific perspective. Yes, there were ghost hunters before Andrew, but quite often their investigations ended up almost as attempts to contact the dead in a spiritualist manner. Whereas Andrew was an absolute rationalist. In a sense, he was a ghost hunter who didn't even believe in ghosts. He eschewed spiritual explanations of the phenomena. Nonetheless, he was convinced these phenomena were real, and he believed they should be investigated from a scientific framework. That's Andrew in later life. That's the paperback edition of Our Haunted Kingdom, and it's a monumental survey of hauntings, really from the late 1940s up to 1973 on a county by county basis. I was very interested in the 3 entries he had in relation to Suffolk. This is what actually got Andrew into ghost hunting, and this is what decorated the cover of the first edition. This is a picture of 16 Montpelier Road in Ealing, taken in 1944, September 1944. It was Andrew's first ghost hunt. It was almost his last. If we look up at the left-hand window, you may make out a shape which Andrew himself interpreted, and other people looking at it interpreted since. There appears to be a form in the window. Now, this is not a particularly good reproduction. There also seems to be a horizontal line, slightly filmy, rather like a net curtain, you can see in that picture. Well, when Andrew took the photograph in September 1944, there were no curtains. So possibly we have a photograph of a ghostly curtain. Even more interesting, however, is the form which people have interpreted as a form of a young girl. Admittedly, Andrew said that other people had seen shapes, forms in this window, but he took this photograph after his visit with his father, who was the equivalent of Air Raid Warden Hodges on Dad's Army for Ealing. He was in charge of civil defence, and they were surveying this property, which had stood empty for 10 years, as a place to store furniture from bombed out buildings. It had a reputation for being haunted. Well, when Andrew took this photograph, the property was empty. It was taken about 2:30 in the afternoon on a Saturday afternoon in September 1944. But when developed, these were the days when you had to take your films off to the photographers, off to the chemists, and you'd get them back in an envelope a week later. This was what appeared in the window. Now, the run up to taking this photograph included a whole lot of strange experiences Andrew underwent personally in that house on that afternoon. Feelings of being touched, feelings of a presence, which culminated in, he said, of an urge to actually commit suicide, to kill himself by leaping from a tower at the back of the building. Well, fortunately for the future of modern ghost hunting and my own interest in the subject, his father intervened and in the nick of time stopped him leaping off the roof. Andrew said he went into a semi-trance state where he received a message in his mind that it was only 12 inches down to the lawn, whereas in fact it was 70 feet, and he should step down from the roof down into the lawn. Well, fortunately, his father grabbed him by the scruff of the neck in time, saying, "I don't want any suicides in the family," and he was saved. But he said at that moment, he was convinced he'd had some kind of message to throw himself off the roof. When he investigated the story of the house further, locally it was believed to have a most sinister history. The stories were that between 1884 up until 1934, more than 20 people had actually committed suicide leaping from the back of the house from this tower. There'd also been a murder, which was confirmed by Andrew's own mother, who had been a nurse in 1934, who told him the story of how she'd attended the scene of the murder, where a young nursemaid had thrown a baby off the top of the tower and then jumped to her own death. Now, considerable doubt has emerged in the years since as to the validity of those stories, but nonetheless, that was what Andrew was told by Ealing police a week after he'd obtained this photograph. Nonetheless, it set him off in a career on interest in ghost hunting. It's a strange photograph. It's been analysed since by Dr. Barry Colvin most recently in 2014. The upshot is Dr. Colvin, having examined the original negative, is that you can't really determine what is in that window. There's been no tampering with the picture, but it is, in a sense, like so many photographs, rather ambiguous. Nonetheless, it convinced Andrew that ghosts could be photographed, and it made a very influential cover, which helped get me interested in the subject. That's not a very good enlargement, but you might be able to make out the beginnings of a face. And also there's this weird question of the square, which appears to be some kind of curtain. Well, there were no curtains in 1944, so maybe we've got a ghostly curtain. Andrew's own one sure sighting of a ghost was seeing a small dog in the house that belonged to his uncle in 1952. Now, ghostly animals are quite rare. Probably about 1 in 100 sightings of a ghost involve an animal. But subsequently, Andrew Green traced the owners of the house and found that they had indeed possessed a similar dog to the one he'd seen, which had been seen by a number of people in the same bedroom over the previous 12 months. They said it had been like their son to them. But then one night, they'd heard a screech of tyres. They went outside. They found the dog had been run over. And they told Andrew it was like their son to them. They were so upset they left the house. Now, Andrew's own view was that it was not a ghostly dog coming back to them. It was, in fact, the concentrated emotion of that distressed couple that yielded the apparition. Andrew settled in Sussex eventually. He was near this place, Battle Abbey, which he monitored over a number of years, many sightings of ghosts, and in fact they date back to the 1930s. And his work and his books were very much concentrated on historic haunted sites. If you asked Andrew about his own theories of what ghosts were, he dismissed any spiritual theory. He thought ghosts were electromagnetic. They were produced by the human brain. Ghosts were a kind of electromagnetism somewhere on the electromagnetic spectrum, which enabled them to be photographed and also to cause effects which could be recorded as sound. He thought that they were simply a case of energy. Now, when I first read these sort of theories at the age of 11 to 13, and I was heavily into science, my original aim was to be a scientist, an astronomer, not a lawyer. I found this convincing, and I thought this was probably the explanation, and I very much went along with the idea that ghosts must be some simple problem that can be solved by physics. Ultimately, everything could be reduced down to equations, to the great developments of physics and chemistry and science in the last 150 years. Well, how naive was I now wonder, in putting such faith in science. But, I had such things as the junior chemistry set. That was the days when we're going back to the 1970s, when young lads like myself could actually buy chemistry sets which contained chemicals and substances you were quite good at making explosions. I mean, today we'd probably have social services and the anti-terrorism squad round. But nonetheless, I thought there was a purely scientific explanation, which Green, as a humanist, he was not at all religious, endorsed as the explanation to ghosts. And I must admit, I no longer take that reductionist view, but I am always glad that was the first serious book on ghosts I studied, because it gave me a grounding in approaching this subject. Here's Andrew in later years in Battle Abbey grounds. He ended up advising English Heritage on the subject of ghosts. English Heritage realised ghosts were a bit of a money at Battle Abbey. And also he deserves credit for launching the world's first evening courses in parapsychology and psychical research 50 years ago at the sadly now closed Pike House Battle in Sussex. These appear to have been the first evening classes recognised in adult education on the subject of ghosts, ghost hunting, and psychical research. And he carried on cataloguing ghosts. This was a 1980 book, which listed a further 350 cases, which he hadn't included in Our Haunted Kingdom. Andrew very much believed ghosts were a day-to-day reality which many people experienced. And I think that probably is the case. We only have a fraction of human experience to study. In later years, he concentrated just on local stories. His psi theories were telepathy and PK associated with troubled individuals, energy or effects, essentially electromagnetic, which linger after death, and that there's no conscious agency. In other words, no spirits, no survival of individual personality. And the answers were to be found in the electromagnetic spectrum. An utterly rationalist point of view. And I am very glad I always read his book first in terms of a grounding. In terms of photographs, I always remember seeing this on East Anglian regional television, a program called the news program Look East, when it featured in a book about famous photographs taken in Norfolk. And this is supposedly the Brown Lady of Rainham Hall in North Norfolk. For many years, I believed this could be a genuine ghost photograph. But one of the things I've learned about ghost hunting is that when one comes across particularly a historic story, you have to trace it back to its actual roots. Now, this photograph has a story which goes back to September 1936. Two photographers from the magazine Country Life, Mr. Indra Shira and Captain Townsend, came to take pictures for the Christmas edition of Country Life magazine at the home of the Marchioness of Townsend, their family seat being Rainham Hall. And the story goes about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. One of them saw a vague form coming down the staircase. They urged Captain Townsend, was in charge of the camera. It was one of those crash bang wallop type pictures, camera arrangements. He quickly exposed a plate, and this was the resultant image, which was published on the 26th of December in Country Life magazine. Is this a ghost? Well, for many years, I actually thought this was perhaps one ghost photograph which stood the test of time. I was lucky enough to, sometime I'll mention in a little while, Dennis Bardens, then a reporter for the Daily Express, actually went to Rainham Hall in January 1937 to investigate the photograph further. And he seemed to think it was genuine from all the inquiries he made. It was accepted as such. However, what I also discovered when I went back to the archives of the Society for Psychical Research was a file from January 1937, compiled by the then research officer, Mr. C.V.C. Herbert, which actually draws attention to a number of problems in this photograph. Mr. Herbert identified that and interviewed the photographers and said that they'd uncapped or in a great hurry. And he formed the impression that there had been shaking of the camera through the vertical and possibly the horizontal plane. And I then began to realize, as I read the file, that maybe I had not looked at this photograph as closely as I should. Now, when one actually looks away from the ghost, one starts to notice some strange anomalies. If you look to the left of the figure, you find a great sort of square-shaped or rectangular black space, apparently on the staircase. Now, could it be that this is actually a shaken double exposure? The plate was exposed for 6 seconds, and what you're actually seeing is the portrait above. And you look at the angle of the banisters, and they seem to be out of sync, and so on. Now, suddenly I realized I'd looked at this photograph many times, but never really looked at it. And there's all kinds of theories about how it came about, including that Mr. Indra Shira, who seems to have adopted a pseudonym to make him sound as though he came from the Indian subcontinent, but in fact he was discovered to be a short little Scotsman. It seems to be, one suggestion is that he just simply smeared the plate. Well, it's hard to say in the absence of the original photograph negative, but the original plate was inspected by Herbert. Where it is now, I don't know. But looking at the prints that they subsequently produced at a shilling a piece for purchase, one can see that maybe there are problems with this photograph. So reluctantly, I have to say that this picture, which I once thought maybe showed a ghost, really may have other explanations. There are alternative views. Tom Ruffles of the Society for Psychical Research is an advocate and a defender of the validity of this photograph. Ultimately, the best test would be to go back to Raynham Hall and to see if we could recreate it. However, getting into Raynham Hall costs about £1,000 a pop at the moment, and the other condition is that you've got to go there to get married. Now, since I don't want to commit bigamy, I think this might be a step too far. But if any of you are planning nuptials in the future and you've got a spare £1,000, maybe you could help investigate the provenance of this photograph. Let's turn on to another author who interested me at the time in my youth. This was Peter Underwood, author of this book, Gazetteer of British Ghosts, a marvellous compendium of both recent, modern, up-to-date ghost stories mixed with the most unbelievable folklore. It made it irresistible. That was Green's book. So we've got a couple of, this is Peter Underwood. Here's Peter Underwood. He was president of the Ghost Club from 1962 to 1993. He like Andrew Green, he produced a lot of books, and he was a great influence on researchers today, many active researchers today, simply because there wasn't much else available in the 1970s. Ultimately, he was a great storyteller. I've come to doubt one or two of his claims. He was described to me as somewhat vainglorious, but nonetheless, he did write some very interesting and entertaining books, which I'd commend. And perhaps most notably, he was responsible for bringing Bali Rectory back into public attention in the 1970s with this book, The Ghosts of Bali. Bali Rectory was, I'm sure almost everybody's heard of Bali Rectory. Well, it's more or less thanks to the efforts of Peter Underwood with this book, The Ghosts of Bali, which he wrote with Paul Tabori, who was the literary executor of Harry Price, that Bali came back into public consciousness. For those of you who may not have heard of Bali Rectory, well, you do a little bit of reading. There's actually a lot to read. Bali Rectory was reputedly the most haunted house in England. Built in 1862, the site of unrivaled paranormal activity until its destruction by fire in 1939. An ugly red brick building, but throughout its history, 5 successive rectors and their families maintained they had experienced ghostly phenomena. Of course, the rectory went in 1939 in a spectacular Hammer House horror ending of burning down, even blamed on one of the ghosts. And it's been suggested that the haunting then switched to the church, dedication unknown, across the road. And this was this was just a mere 17 miles from where I grew up in Bury St Edmunds. So this was the site of one of my first attempts at investigating or visiting a haunted site in 1976. Bali Rectory was put on the map thanks to very much the man in the raincoat on the left, Harry Price, known as the Prince of Ghost Hunters. He was really the man who brought ghost hunting and psychical research into the public mind prior to World War II. And he spent 20 years on the Bali case. He wrote 2 books, The Most Haunted House in England and The End of Bali Rectory, in which he catalogued the numerous phenomena associated with it. Also in the photograph to the far right, you see his collaborator, Molly Goldney, a lady who was an active psychic researcher, member of the Society for Psychical Research. In between, you see a couple, the Reverend Lionel Foyster and his wife, Marianne. And there are also 2 adopted children. Now, a lot of the poltergeist activity at Bali Rectory occurs during the 5 years that the clergyman and his wife Marianne are resident. And in fact, examining the lives, the private lives of this couple has become an industry in itself for Bali fanatics. It's less about studying a haunted house, but more the personalities of the people in it. This was Marianne Foyster, apparently rather pleased at receiving a bottle of Johnny Walker whiskey from somebody at some point. More interesting is this photograph, I think. Marianne Foyster, there's whole books and studies of this lady, was the centre of poltergeist activity for about 18 months from when she moved in 1931. What one notices, however, if you look at this photograph, she's a very small woman. You look at the relative size of that baby, it's either a very fat, big baby, or she's a very small, slight woman. The stories about this lady include her 4 bigamous marriages. She seems to have had quite a colourful career, which in the round has been used to discredit any of the testimony. This is the leading skeptical book on Bali, published in 1956 by Eric Dingwall, Kathleen Goldney, who previously visited, and the arch skeptic Trevor Hall. And it's astonishing the steps that Trevor Hall took to actually try and track down Marianne Foyster long after she'd left the rectory, long after she'd left the United Kingdom. She moved to the United States and Canada. He had an absolute obsession with her and her admittedly rather colourful and racy private life at times. And however, all of that, as I look back on my own experiences, what I've learned from visiting haunted houses, meeting people who are at the centre of paranormal phenomena or alleged paranormal phenomena, to me that does not necessarily discredit some of the phenomena at the rectory. One could go on endlessly about, you could give whole talks, in fact whole books have been written about this woman and her various doings, alleged wrongs and so forth. It strikes me in the balance that she might well have been exactly the troubled type of person, admittedly a bit older than the typical adolescent associated with poltergeist activity, who might well have attracted phenomena. So although Bali Rectory has been denounced as a huge, overblown, sensationalized equivalent of the now discredited Amityville horror set in Essex, in fact, I think there may well be more to this case. In fact, there's still a large locked box of Bali information held at Cambridge University Library, which has been under the custody of the Society for Psychical Research for 50 years. It's awaiting investigation. There could well be more to this case. News, very much thanks to Peter Underwood's efforts in the 1970s. It even made the front discussions of ghosts, which featured heavily Bali in a program called The Ghost Hunters in 1975, made the front cover of the Radio Times. So the very fact that we Peter Underwood's efforts. He wasn't the only person, however, who interested himself in Bali. This is a photograph in 1954 of Philip Paul, who's the gentleman second to on the left with the cigarette in his mouth, a Fleet Street crime journalist. He actually got an excavator and dug up the site of Bali Rectory. He also held 7 consecutive vigils, each on the 28th of July from 1950 to 1957, waiting for the ghostly nun, who was the prima donna of the Bali apparitions and was supposed to turn up every 28th of July. It ended up with Panorama turning up Halloween 1955 to cover Bali. Philip Paul was somebody else I was pleased to meet and know. This is a picture of him on the right, appearing with the television personality Gilbert Harding, who was a great character of the early years of BBC television broadcasting. He died in 1960. He was kind of the man you love to hate on television. And Philip Paul famously turned up on a program called What's My Line and beat the entire panel, whose task was to guess what jobs the visitors had, by saying his career was as a ghost hunter. And it became national news. But Philip Paul was an interesting chap who began as a spiritualist after some tragic personal experiences in 1938. Here we see Philip Paul with Gerald Gardner, the founder of modern witchcraft. Philip doubled a career in as a Fleet Street crime journalist, with being an editor of Psychic News in the 1950s, until he gave up on spiritualism. He'd remained interested in the paranormal. Many of his best investigations are included in this book, Some Unseen Power, published in 1985. And we were pleased to welcome him back to the Ghost Club. Philip Paul had revived the Ghost Club in 1954, but unfortunately a committee room squabble with Peter Underwood resulted in him departing about 6 months afterwards. And he stayed away from the Ghost Club for many, many years. Peter Underwood departed from the Ghost Club in 1993, but I was very pleased to welcome Philip Paul back to the Ghost Club in 2004, because we owed him a great debt of gratitude for having been the man who brought about the 1954 revival. And I welcomed him back with the words, well, after 48 years, it's very glad to have you back here, Philip, before you were so rudely interrupted. And he was a marvellous fellow who shared all kinds of insights on the paranormal. Another figure that I was pleased to encounter through the Ghost Club was this man, Dennis Bardens, founder of Panorama Programme, veteran broadcaster and journalist for some 70 years. His own book, Ghosts and Hauntings, 1965, was the one which actually brought the Raynham Hall photograph back into circulation, brought it back into public awareness. much I could tell you about Dennis Barden's the most interesting character. He'd done all kinds of things. He was wholly convinced that psychic phenomena existed. The general view was that of most ghost hunters I met in the past was that haunted houses could be divided into poltergeists, which involved physical phenomena, and then hauntings, which involved apparitions, and they were fairly separate classes. It gives an indication of how destructive poltergeists can be. It's the Runkle poltergeists of 1952, 1953, a truly remarkable case. The general theory of poltergeists, at least accepted by most parapsychologists in the last 50, 60 years, is that they are products of living minds, that they are connected with individuals who suffer trauma, particularly adolescents who suffer stress, and this trauma comes out in the form of bursts of psychokinetic energy, which creates noises, moves objects, has registrable environmental effects. Just as an aside, in terms of evidence of paranormal phenomena, I have to say I think that if we had to prove any paranormal phenomena, apart from those statistical studies of psi abilities, the evidence for the poltergeist is unanswerable. Poltergeists exist. They're a worldwide phenomena. They exist as social facts. And the thing about poltergeist activity, which distinguishes them from other forms of psychic or mystical experience, is they are occurring in the objective physical world around us. They leave physical traces, which can be filmed, observed, recorded. It doesn't depend on the word of a single witness. These are public, multi-witnessed events which are recordable on instrumentation. But beyond that, what convinces me of the reality of the poltergeist as a phenomena, whatever lies behind them, is the striking similarity again that you find century after century, location after location, huge, wide geographical separation, nonetheless describing exactly the same set of effects. So I think they are of spontaneous phenomena, that is, phenomena occurring outside laboratory and clinical settings, without doubt, the best established phenomena. But maybe our ideas about poltergeists are not as complete as one would wish. Take you to the case of the poltergeist that wrote letters, initially investigated by Andrew Green in 1956. Now, Andrew Green visited the particular house concerned. This is one of the poltergeist letters he received. He experienced strange phenomena in the house. He said he heard strange knocks, footsteps he couldn't explain, but he became rapidly skeptical when he got this letter addressed to Monsieur Green. In fact, he got 9 letters and a Christmas card from the poltergeist, which made him very skeptical, and he backed away from the case. The alleged poltergeist wrote in this curious script. More lately, this case has been revived in a Radio 4 series called The Battersea Poltergeist. A truly remarkable case. It lasted from 1956 to 1968. The letters which Green received were only a fraction. Having myself had the opportunity to examine them, I gave up counting, but there are at least 3,000 to 4,000 written communications and sort of wrapped out notes of communicated seance, coded communications which were written down. A truly awesome amount of material. It occurred at Wycliffe Road. This is Danny Robbins, who recently revived this story for Radio 4. And it's on the left we have an article from Fate magazine, and we have the best book on the case so far has been written by Shirley Hitchins, who was the focus of the case, and paranormal writer and researcher James Clark from London. This book came out in 2013. The reference to Louis XVII and the Poltergeist Prince is the poltergeist claimed to be the Dauphin, the son of King Louis XVI in France, who, after 150 years after he disappeared in the Bastille during the French Revolution, supposedly came back to cause problems at this house, 63 Wycliffe Road, for the Hitchins family who occupied it. And phenomena occurred at this house between 1956 and 1968. Now, I first met Shirley in 2014 at a meeting of the London Fortean Society, and I'd been asked along to interview her, and she'd agreed to give an interview. She didn't want to give a talk, but she, now a lady in her 70s, she said she was prepared to be interviewed. And it proved very interesting indeed, because I'd heard the version from Andrew Green that I'd received these letters and a Christmas card from Louis the 17th, who also for some reason wanted to be called Donald, and frankly that's where I stopped believing. Was how did the ghost put first of all write the letter, then put it in an envelope, then affix a stamp to it, and then put it in the post to mail it off to Andrew Green? Fair point. So I started off with interviewing Shirley, and I gave an introduction rather similar to the one I presented here. And then I asked her the question. I said, well, and it was in front of an audience. I said, Shirley, well, the question that I'm sure many people listening would like to know the answer to, above all else, was what was it like living with a dead teenage French prince? And I always remember her answer. She said it was terrifying. And at that point, I began to realize there was a lot more to this story of this crazy story of a letter writing poltergeist, as she began to explain the effects it had upon her adolescence and adulthood, on her entire family, which made me realize that whatever was going on was not some simple case of hoaxing. I mean, it received a lot of publicity, it got in the news and so forth. You might think it was attention getting and so on. But as the details emerged, that appeared to be far from the case. This was Shirley and her family. You can see her father, Wally Hitchins, her mother, and an adopted older brother, who I initially suspected may have been responsible for the phenomena. That was one view I formed on it. Except he moved out of the house in 1957 and moved to Australia, which rather gave him a complete alibi for the next 11 years, because it went on for 12 years. This was the man who actually investigated a now forgotten figure called Harold Chibbett, with whom I feel some empathy, because his day job was being a tax inspector, whereas I spend my daily life wrestling with the monstrosities of council tax. So maybe I haven't taken up pipe smoking, though I do admire the three-piece suit. This is Shirley today. Filmed a couple of years ago when the story started to get more attention. She sticks to her story. It is a true mystery. This was the one of the last recorded portraits of the Dauphin, who claimed to be the Battersea spook. And for some reason, I had this obsession with this now forgotten actor and teenage starlet called Jeremy Spencer. Now, it all just gets absolutely absurd. But the sheer volume of material, the sheer number of witnesses, starts to make you think that whatever was going on was something very strange indeed, and there certainly seem to have been paranormal effects at some level. The strange thing about the Dauphin writing letters is his level of French was pretty appalling. It's scattered words. He calls himself Capet, the surname of the more ami, but the rest of the time he writes in English. Altogether very strange. And they brought in spiritualists, and here we see, you just see that's Shirley looking rather worried in the presence of a spiritualist circle in 1956, organised by a man called Hanks, whose day job was being a tube driver. All kinds of efforts were made to try and solve this case, but none of them were completely satisfactory. And again, if we come on to spiritualism, we've got a huge area here of study, and it's unclear where this quite overlaps with ghost hunting. To what extent can the mediumistic theory that ghosts are spirits of the dead really hold up? What we can say is there were remarkable mediums, certainly in the past, who could achieve all kinds of strange effects. Holmes was a particularly interesting medium because he could apparently carry out these effects in good light, not in darkened seance room conditions. Equally, the history of physical phenomena in the seance room is the history of fraud. You may be less convinced by this photograph from 1873 of Katie King, supposedly a materialized spirit. She actually appears to be kneeling on a reflective table. Very strange story indeed, but one vouched for initially by Sir William Crookes, one of the leading 19th century physicists. But the problem is we're going into historic examination of cases here, but certainly it can be said the most remarkable physical phenomena were claimed in seance rooms in the 19th and early 20th century, but they seem to have vanished after the introduction of infrared photography on a large scale in the mid-1940s. Nonetheless, if we go back to traditional ghosts, you probably have come across haunted pubs. Now, one of the things about haunted pubs, which might be suggestive of spirit survival, is the fact they are haunted for so long. It's difficult to attribute all of them simply to publicity gimmicks, but this is the Seven Stars in Robertsbridge in Sussex, which had a 32-year history of manifestations with 12 changes of licensee during the time. Now, it's hard to believe that all 12 licensees and their families contained at least one person creating poltergeist phenomena. What this seems to point to is perhaps a place-centered phenomena behaving like a haunting, independent of the occupiers, and which may indicate the presence of some kind of surviving entity or spirit. Now, I personally don't particularly like that theory or analysis. Equally, I can't say as I've got a better explanation for this kind of long-running haunting. Then, of course, I was very lucky as well to meet Maurice Grosse, name I'm sure many of you know. Inventor and psychical researcher, investigated the Enfield Poltergeist. I originally met Maurice on an edition of the Channel 4 Right to Reply programme back in November 1987. basically I'd complained about a program called Is Anybody There, which was best described as a Halloween hatchet job, presented a 2-hour special presented by skeptical psychologist Nicholas Humphrey. You can watch it on YouTube. And just in the process of passing the bar exams, I was rather unimpressed by the way they treated the evidence for and against the paranormal. And I ended up saying that, you know, if you treated evidence like this in a courtroom, your case would immediately end up in the Court of Appeal. Well, anyway, they were so desperate for anybody to take part in the program, it appeared, which was a program whereby aggrieved viewers could vent their fury and foam, and that was served up as entertainment on a Saturday night afterwards. Lo and behold, the other person who put in a strident complaint was Maurice Gross, who had been, of course, one of the key investigator, along with Guy Playfair, at the famous or now infamous Enfield Poltergeist case, 1977-79. Well, Maurice and myself got on very well indeed. And I kept in touch with Maurice and met him on many occasions, joined a committee with him in 2000. He came to speak to the Ghost Club, and it was a great privilege to know him. He was an absolutely serious and sound individual. Maurice was not a person who believed in theories, but he said the living agent theory, that is, it was all coming out of the subconscious minds of the teenage girls, was not adequate to explain what they experienced. I mean, they conducted 1,500 hours of observations. They recorded well over 100 hours of tape recordings, numerous photographs, films, 25 all-night vigils, at least 30 different independent witnesses to strange things happening in the house. And if you just look at the photograph here, you can see the mother, Peggy Harper. You know, this is a genuine photograph. You just look at the expression on this woman's face. She is terrified by what is going on. And more controversially is the photographs of Janet apparently levitating from the bed. When you actually look at the totality of the evidence, and if you read indeed the book, this house is haunted, 1980, closely, which many people have never done, but if you read it closely, you realize that this was a most horrendous set of experiences for that family. You can see Janet's older sister there, clearly quite terrified by what's going on. And on top of that, there's also the medical evidence. I mean, Maurice and Guy Playfair called in the medics. They had no explanation for what was happening. Janet here was going into fits, into trances. They diagnosed everything from schizophrenia to hysteria. She, in fact, ended up spending 6 weeks in hospital, undergoing every medical test they could come up with, and she came out as physically and mentally normal. Some people have said, well, this is all down, if we take the narrow approach on poltergeist, this is down to problems with the central nervous system. There may be something in that. The brain, parts of the brain, central nervous system, something is occurring here which causes poltergeist effects. But it's more difficult to explain that in the long-lasting cases of poltergeists, those that show communications. Normally our nervous system doesn't unconsciously communicate with anything other than feelings of dear me, or sensations, intuitions. We don't normally get massive communications from the central nervous system. Strange physical symptoms show up in case after case, however, which makes you wonder, is it a problem of the nervous system of the people living in the house, or is it a problem which is inflicted on them? Morris certainly took the view that what he witnessed in that house over 18 months of close observation could not be explained by the mind of an 11-year-old girl or a 13-year-old girl, or in fact anybody in that house. The case was further subjected to a study, the EPIC report, the Enfield Poltergeist Investigation Committee of 1982, where all the original witnesses and sources were re-examined by a committee of the Society for Psychical Research. They came to the conclusion at the end of that report, genuine psychokinetic effects occurred in that house, was the only conclusion they could reach based on an evidential approach. Now, the view is a split one within parapsychology. You've got William Roll, a great poltergeist investigator, who says that living minds are largely there to explain it, but other people have taken the view that no, maybe there's some discarnate effects. I mean, particularly when you look at destructive effects on the body. This is Eleanor Zugan, 13-year-old Romanian girl, showing scratches, signs of injury from her poltergeist. Now, one of the views is that we know a lot more these days, or might recognize things such as self-harm, but many of these poltergeist agents seem to really physically suffer. And we can also look at some of the earlier literature in psychology on hysterical conditions. This is one recorded in the 19th century, very similar to the patterns observed at Enfield with the movements of Janet's body, which were attributed to levitation. If you saw something like that you might think it was levitation, psychical levitation, but it's the arching of the nervous system. Now, these extreme phenomena were found within patients who were incarcerated in mental homes, who had been there sometimes for years. And it was, this is the origins of the modern idea of, or modern concept of, hysteria. But you can see there's clearly something going on very wrong, very, very unpleasant here. Where is it coming from? It's not something that people would voluntarily go through. And this, of course, opens up into a much wider subject, possibility of what's been called demonic possession in the past. One of the best lectures I've ever heard on psychical research came from this man, Canon Dominic Walker, later Bishop of Monmouth. He had a most interesting job. He spoke at the Ghost Club in July 1996. Talked about how he trains. He's a qualified psychologist who trains the exorcists of the Church of England. Very interesting to hear his views on these phenomena. What we can say is whatever is behind these things is that they happen. It can't be ascribed simply to misperception, to failures of our own nervous system. They involve major physical effects. And, after years in ghost hunting, I conclude that what we can tentatively say is that poltergeist activity, ghostly activity, energy is clearly involved and it's recordable. It's some parts of it are electromagnetic in nature, but not all of them. It defies recognized physical laws, but it is subject to restrictions and patterns. And it ties up with certain personalities at certain times with certain medical conditions. And this energy also fades away in time, that not even ghosts are immortal. But there's a lot more I could say, but let me say that in reaching these tentative conclusions, what I've learned two things, really. First of all, Anything I've got to say on the subject is because, in Newton's words, I stand on the shoulders of giants, of other people who have investigated, studied, and researched and actively put themselves into the field long before me. And so I have simply absorbed things. But there are many other phenomena out there as well. One of the things I've learned is how much we don't know. I've sometimes asked, have I become more skeptical or more of a believer? What I've learned is how much we don't really know at all about almost anything when we get to the edges, to the boundaries. And those boundaries are fascinating. It's the boundaries that so many of these phenomena seem to occur. There's a whole psychic side to so-called UFO experiences. I haven't done much in the way of UFO research. Admittedly, even I had to ask myself, I might have stepped over the mark of eccentricity in 2000 when I travelled to Colombia in South America to look into the case of a man who had been killed by a flying saucer in 1969. Even I had to admit that was something of an odd thing to do, but equally somebody has to do it, I suppose. But I think there may well be a whole side to the UFO phenomena side. Then, of course, there's strange coincidences. Now, many of us will have experienced those in one form or another. There's the whole literature of mysticism, which is an enormous field. Just before me on my desk, I have a book called The Physical Phenomena of Mysticism by a Roman Catholic priest called Herbert Thurston. Father Herbert Thurston died over 80 years ago. A huge collection of phenomena recorded in the Roman Catholic Church over the years. And whatever we're doing, whatever you might do in ASSAP or any other research organisation, it's important to realise that science has its limits. It can only go so far. Beyond that, well, the most important thing, I think, is to have a bit of courageous thinking. The most important thing is be prepared to take those steps. Now, each of us can only take those individually. But what I've also gathered over the years is that one must never dismiss personal experience, personal judgments, because ultimately you are the people on the spot. And what you see, what you observe, what you sense, what you can understand may well be the best verdict we have on any of these striking and amazing phenomena. But I think at this point we better stop. Actually, I've rattled on for an awfully long time, and I'm touched if there's still people tuned in now. But thank you all very much for listening.
Thanks, Alan. Fantastic talk as always. So it's time for us to address the questions, and I'm sure you'd like to grab a drink first. Do you want to grab a drink, or you're right?
I'm okay. I've still got my glass.
Okay. Fantastic. Right, so I'm just going back up through all the questions that were asked. While I'm scrolling back up to start going through, I'm going to start by just introducing a couple of things because some people might have to go. If you're not a member, and many of you have come on today for the first time, we can be found, I'll pop it into the chat box, at www.assap.ac.uk, and every week I wear some ridiculous hat and introduce another expert. Next week we have Steve Parsons talking about Ghostology, his revised book on the subject of ghosts and ghost hunting. This week, as you know, was Alan. The week after, we have Keith Linder, who's written 3 books on his experiences in a poltergeist case in the United States, and Keith tends to talk at length as well. So these talks are free to any member who'd like to come, and we email them out every week to members, and you can join for £5, which gives you full membership, but you get PDFs of the magazine and journal. Or if you'd like print copies, it's £20 a year. So £5 a year or £20 a year. 10p for a talk like Alan's. So, Alan, I think it was worth a lot more than that, don't you? But 10p.
Who am I to judge? You know,
Alan.
long as no one's selling their soul, I don't mind.
Oh, well, as a lawyer, I would have thought you'd been good to negotiate that. Let's start with the obvious first question, which is, while we're waiting, Inska is on holiday, didn't have a link. I emailed her mine. That's absolutely fine. Yep, that should work. Oh, Kel Cooper's here. Good evening, Kel. Kel is coming up in the future.
Hello, Kel.
Good evening. Cheers, Alan. Thank you very much for the talk.
Pleasure.
Which pub are you in, Kel? That looks familiar, but...
It is the Blacksmith.
Okay. And you're going to be talking to us on Phone Calls from the Dead in the near future. We've got Christopher Lawson, the parapsychologist. I'm just going down. Hi, Kieran. You're going to be doing a talk for us soon. Good evening, Bethan Briggs-Miller. She's going to be running a podcast on Erie, Essex. And I think we've got some good Essex ghost stories. We'll talk about that in a minute, Ellen.
Indeed, I'm sure.
Adam Springs, Susie. I'm just going down for the first question. Oh, Morris from Northern Ireland. And Claire did what I should have said and put them there. Lindsay Civita says, we love you, Alan. And we're now going. Okay. So, before we start all these, I'm going to ask a straightforward question, which is, do you think the evidence suggests a spiritual element to the universe, rather than a reductionist materialist element? Do you believe in a kind of Cartesian dualist differentiation of mind and matter? Is there something beyond the physical plane?
Well, my answer to that would be yes. I'm not into giving ambiguous answers unless I feel particularly ambiguous. I don't think that the current materialist model, otherwise it would have worked by now. If all its predictions were correct, would have answered all these questions. Well, it doesn't. As I said, there are boundaries of science. There's plenty of questions that science can't answer, particularly ethical ones and so on. No, I don't think reductionism works. And if I'm wrong, well, I suppose it's a version of Pascal's best bet argument. But overall, if one looks at it, there's just too many. There's plenty of alternatives to the idea of what's known as monism. That it's just the material world in its different expressions. I feel, and it may well be beyond any kind of proof, that there must be a further dimension beyond the current one. Because, and in fact, that's not an original argument. I mean, I think it goes back to Immanuel Kant, who started to question, after 1700 years, question various basic things about perception and the limits of knowledge. And wherever you may draw the boundary, wherever you say that knowledge ends, well, the very fact you draw a boundary, there is something beyond it. And that's where we may not be able to go ever, or we may not be able to comprehend it whilst we are embodied in the flesh. Overall, I think it is best to accept there is a boundary. There's so much before we even get onto the paranormal. There is just so much we do not know or understand about the physical world here and now, how the brain operates, being the classic one, consciousness, or how we perceive things. These are problems that may not actually be solvable within a kind of three-dimensional matrix or framework. I'm thinking here about if anyone can work out a way to do it. I mean, there's experiences that everybody is having, probably right at this moment, that we cannot analyze in terms of existing models or existing or mathematical formula. The sense of taste or smell, we really don't have a formula to do it. If anybody can come up with a way to represent a smell in terms of something you can put in a 2 centimeter by 2 centimeter box, That is, you can draw or create something to go into that graphically into that box that will create a smell. We will clean up, because I will put that forward to the European trademark registry in Alicante, which since 1995 has said you could get a trademark in a smell. But the problem everybody fails on is they can't draw a smell in a 2 centimetre by 2 centimetre box in a way that you experience the smell when you look at that box. We're talking about a whole different level of perception and experience, which can't be reduced down to formula, to mathematical symbols, and so on. It's, you know, there are levels of reality which we experience here and now that can't be encapsulated. So, you know, that very reason alone makes me think there must be some wider spiritual, however you want to call it, immaterial, intangible dimension beyond this. We can't explain, you know, the idea that the brain is just a computer made of meat, which goes back to somebody at Massachusetts Institute of Technology in the 1990s. Well, that just doesn't really explain the brain or what any of us are experiencing right now.
I don't know whether you call them qualia or qualia, but sense experiences continue to be a mystery, as is consciousness.
Mm.
We can't describe any sense experience that we have, and the mystery of consciousness suggests that, you know, Cartesian dualism becomes the default position for epistemologists. But there's all kinds of ways to argue away with. There's many attempts to argue that consciousness doesn't exist. But the interesting question for me then is, if ghosts are mind stuff, if they are consciousness, you know, if they're related to consciousness, how do they interact with the physical? So my next question, and it will be a very quick question, I think you'll find this straightforward, is: do ghosts reflect light? Do light photons bounce off ghosts?
Sorry, what was it? Do they
reflect light? Do light photons bounce off them? Is that how we see them? Do we see them? If we see a solid object like my hand, you're seeing the light striking it and reflecting back to your eye, and it's, you know, then processed by
my view is that no, ghosts may create light effects, is what I might say, whatever ghosts are. But I don't think they actually reflect light. I think about my own experience of seeing an apparition in 2011. If I'd had a camera, I don't think I would have recorded anything. My own impression as I looked at this form was that I was looking at something that wasn't visible in the visual spectrum. This probably doesn't make much sense, because it doesn't make much sense to me. But I was looking at something beyond the visual spectrum. And whatever was going on, well, it could well have been hallucinatory. There was something there at the end of the bed, but it was also something which wasn't in the visual spectrum. But at the same time, I could perceive it. So in my view, it's some other faculty in the brain beyond ordinary perception, which is there. Saying that, however, I don't rule it out completely, because if you look at the literature of ghostly encounters, of folklore, fairy sightings, this kind of thing, there's this typical thing about you see them from the corner of the eye. I mean, I can think of two police officers, 1975, outside Bury St Edmunds Abbey, about 2 o'clock in the morning. Said they were chatting there in front of the on the very dark Angel Hill Square. Suddenly, from the corner of their eye, they glimpsed something which appeared to be almost a monk-like shape gliding along the wall. And when we think of the structure of the eye, it's divided into rods and cones. And there's parts of the eye which operate in low illumination, which are typically on the side of the eyeball or the side of the retina, where perceptual vision is is from the side view, and so there may it becomes very complicated and difficult indeed on this kind of thing. There must be some kind of physiological tie-up. Obviously, something is happening to the nervous system. Something's clearly happening to the nervous system with people like Janet Harper and other people who who suffer possession symptoms and if you look at the history of poltergeist cases, the number of cases that refer to, say, this person's walked in their sleep or showed fits or shaking or whatever. So there's clearly something going on which ties up with the nervous system there. Now, whether that includes, I mean, it's an electrochemical system, whether that includes light radiation, again, we don't know. We don't know enough about light on the human body.
I think at some point we'll need to do a talk on medical views of hallucination, because our whole notion of how perception works in hallucination is so far from the actual medical aspect. But we hallucinate, after all, every night when we dream, and to a sense, because we reconstitute reality within our heads, we hallucinate whenever we perceive. The gap between how we perceive normally and a hallucination is a lot smaller than most people think. But that doesn't mean that the hallucination is unreal, or that it doesn't contain an objective reality, or that... Anyway, it doesn't matter. We'll get back into Tyrrell if we get into there and go back into the history of ghosts. Ian Rogley says he's got Paranormal Cheltenham on his desk. We'll have to ask the author of that, Toss, to come and chat to us one night. Joe Terrell says, I could probably get us into Raynham Hall, but sadly this is the one in Raynham, Essex, and not actually haunted. Okay, it was used for BBC's A Christmas Carol. Harry Price brought me into the field, says Robin Bellamy. Yeah. A couple of things about me. Poltergeist. Aaron's got Poltergeist Over England on his desk. Great Harry Price book.
Great book, yes.
What do you think of Robert Wood's book, The Widow of Bali? Have you read it?
I have. Not a lot, actually.
It's probably the muck-raking, unpleasant book I've ever read, isn't it? I mean,
But yeah, it is, and it's got this dreadful Midsummer Murders view of life and society, where everybody is involved with some sinister conspiracy. He compares Marianne Foyster to some savannah plain African predator. I mean, he clearly he had an obsession, like inherited from Trevor Hall, about this woman. But I mean, when you actually look at it in terms of level of evidence, at one point she's still alive when he writes the book. Yeah. He accuses her of murdering her own husband in 1945. Mm-hmm. But when you break it down, that is gossip picked up at a party. When you actually look at the sources of it, and then his explanation of how she then covered this up with doctors and solicitors was she apparently bribed the attending doctor who certified the death certificate with sexual favors.
Felixstowe, wasn't it, or Lowestoft, somewhere like that? I can't imagine.
Campsie Ash in Suffolk. Yeah,
I can't imagine local doctors doing that, to be honest.
Well, this is you sort of wonder about the conversation that supposedly you've got the corpse of the Reverend Lionel Foster there, and that we're supposed to presume that the doctor said something along the lines of, "Well, I see you've just murdered your husband, Mrs. Foyster. If you grant me sexual favors, I will falsify the death certificate."
Yeah, I actually meant one of her other husbands, who he also accuses her of murdering in a bed and breakfast on the East Coast years later. I mean, it is the most scurrilous, unreadable, poisonous book. It's very readable, but it's poisonous. And when Vincent O'Neill saw it, I'm not surprised. He just left psychical research and wanted nothing more to do with it. He's a son of Marianne. And I felt very, very, very... I sent him a set of journals, SPR journals, many years ago. And I think he just left the field entirely in the end.
He did, yeah. Yeah, he got well and truly. And the other thing that pushed him over the edge was the Louis Mailing book.
We faked the Ghosts of Bali Rectory.
Yeah, which was the work of a complete fantasist.
There is a kind of almost psychopathic element of the skeptical community. I mean, it's a tiny 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000 who actually falsify evidence and create whole false narratives to back up their claims that monsters don't exist. And there's far more than that, I'm sure, on the opposite side who fake ghosts at Bali or wherever. But there are also a few people who seem to have a pathological need to disbelieve. Do you think that's a fair comment?
I think it is. And what fascinates me is that if they just think it's rubbish, well, why do they bother? I mean, there's lots of things that I think are nonsense or I'm not interested in or complete waste of time. I don't spend my time, trying to show that everybody involved with it, should be denounced and what idiots they are and trying to discredit it. There's loads of things I don't believe in, but I don't waste my time, obsessing about the fact. Fair enough, we live in a free society, that people are, free to believe what they want, and I'm much happier that they can go to hell in their own way. But it doesn't really worry me that they want to. We each have to get through life in some way. We all have to make our own choices, and it's well, as I say, there clearly I think something exists in the literature which makes them feel uncertain, and some people can't cope with a feeling of uncertainty.
Yeah, ambiguity.
Ambiguity, yeah.
Yeah, I think that there are actually probably now psychological methods to test that. But I've always had a very high capacity to deal with the unusual or ambiguity or not knowing. But a lot of people seem to, it evokes anxiety in them. I'd like to actually do some tests for that at some point. I'm sure there's a literature on it somewhere. Alan, says Andy Wilson, this is a great question. After 45 years of thinking about anomalous activity, if you're going to boil down all the themes in a pot, which one theme would you consider to be the common denominator?
That's a very good question. What is the common denominator? Well, the common denominator is obviously consciousness. Is the common thing, because we don't understand, huge amounts about. Just hazarding a guess off the top of my head, I think maybe the common theme is boundaries. Boundaries between different physical systems, different physical and emotional states, light and dark, life and death, being awake, being asleep, states of consciousness, even geographical boundaries between different areas, crossing boundaries, liminal spaces and places, doorways, staircases. If anything, it's the boundaries where consciousness may shift in one form or another. That seems to be the point to me where whatever dimension or whatever thing lies the other side of the boundary can intrude. Point Andrew Green used to make to me, he said that I've asked many people, what were you thinking about at the time you saw a ghost? And they all say, well, nothing in particular. They certainly weren't thinking about ghosts. It's the moment when you look at the older reports in the days when people did actually read books, where they look up from the book and they get a shift of consciousness between reader and non-reader. And it's in that little space, that boundary crossing, I would say, that these phenomena occur. And you've got this geographically, it shows up. Jeremy Hart the folklorist, did a study in Dorset in 1986, finding some reason ghost sightings seem to cluster on parish boundaries, even if the person had no idea that the boundary was there. I did very one parish study myself, with stories about ghosts in a village called in the villages of the Fornhams, which Chris, and lo and behold, they all cluster around the parish boundary. And if you look at islands are notoriously haunted, edges, margins. That's where if there was one commonality, Points in life, marriage, birth, death, points of transition where typically psychic phenomena may occur. That's where I would look, I suppose, for a commonality.
I was just thinking at Farnham, does the parish boundary follow the Lark?
No, it doesn't. There's three parishes.
Yeah, Martin, Genevieve,
Yeah,
also.
yeah,
I was just trying to
and
figure out what the boundaries are. Because I was the only Farnham ghost I can think of off the top of my head, apart from the spontaneous cow one and Black Shuck, is the Red Hannah, the country ghost of Farnham Park. Rhymer Point's got an interesting one because that's where 7 parish boundaries meet. Just outside Thetford on the road near Honington. It's one of the very few places in England where that occurs. Be interesting to look at the folklore there because it's places where parish boundaries meet. Certainly in fairy lore were significant. Right. Okay. Next one is from Robin Bellamy. In your opinion, are poltergeists connected to people, places, or things?
Well, the answer is both. I'm looking here to the 1979 cluster analysis done of historic poltergeist reports by Alan Gould in the book Poltergeists, written with Tony Cornell. Alan Gould studied 500 historic poltergeist cases from about 584 AD up until 1977. Applied 64 different categories and applied a computer analysis, and he found that they split into 2 recognizable clusters. 76% appear to be short-term, human-focused, person-centered disturbances. Then there was 24%, which you hear about a lot in haunted pubs, which seem to be place-centered, where the occupiers come and go, but the phenomena continue. And the phenomena are long-term. They're much more ghostly. They're strange lights, appearances, temperature drops, whereas the short-term ones tend to be more physical, more random, uncontrolled. So there are recognizable clusters. So I'd say it's a 76-24% split. And it's the 24% that starts, in my view, to point, even though I'm sort of reluctant to endorse this myself, in some kind of survivalist explanation.
Okay. Question from Aaron. With all the technology we have on devices today, movie editing, photo editing, has it made it harder to analyse videos, photos, and accept if they're authentic? I can understand if the Ghost Club receives many of these pieces of evidence.
Well, my own view, which is most depressing and curmudgeonly one, is I don't think we can photograph ghosts. We might be able to record anomalous effects, but what you're looking at is not actually a ghost. If we compare the detailed reports that apparitional witnesses provide, they describe recognizable humans with characteristics and so forth. They know what they see, whereas the photographic evidence is at best ambiguous and in many cases just complete nonsense and wishful thinking. I find it divides into 2 categories. People who actually see a ghost know what they see. They tell you their story. There's no ambiguity about what they've experienced. The people who just simply present photographs want to be told it's a ghost. They want to be reassured that this blob, this rose-arching blot that they basically got obtained from a digital camera, is something ghostly. Now, it may be, I don't rule out the possibility of some weird effect occurring at the time, in the same way as if you've got fish leaping about in a pond, you will get ripples and bubbles. I don't rule that out. But what you are not looking at in any of these photographs is anything remotely resembling an apparition of a recognizable person. which is what people who see a ghost actually see. I think ghosts are closer to, I mean, the nearest example is we can't photograph dreams. We don't doubt we see images and people in dreams, but you can't photograph them. It's but people want to believe, like to hold on to the idea that something is capable of being captured because it gives them something tangible, something material, a sort of touchstone to think, yes, this wonderful spiritual world is actually material and real. But sadly, I used to accept ghost photography. Now I'm afraid I don't. However, I am prepared to say that with some ghost photographs and images that are obtained, yes, they are distinctly weird, to say the least. But could it be that something even weirder is going on? Something even stranger than photographing a ghost would be. That is, I mean, I think back to the Andrew Green image of the shape in the window, the figure of what was interpreted as a young girl. It strikes me as very strange that on his first effort at ghost hunting, he captures this image, which then sets him off on a 60-year career on ghost hunting. And could it be that these effects, whatever they are targeted, directed for certain people at certain times?
Which leads to the question, Alan, what are the odds that two people who grew up 2 streets apart in Bury St Edmunds in the 1970s and 1980s would go on to lead 2 of the psychical research organisations at this point in history, and that both of them grew up within 3 miles of where M.R. James, the great ghost story writer, also grew up? It is quite strange, isn't it?
Well, there are these strange coincidences in life, these synchronicities, and I've known lots of intelligent people who did not dismiss them. I think it's much better to listen to and accept that these things go on. Whatever it means is difficult to say. I think if you get coincidences and synchronicities in life, it's a good sign. It is rather odd, to say the least. But the world is full of odd things and odd people these days. So, one mustn't make too much of it.
The last time I walked down Acacia Avenue, I've been to the chip shop on Mitchell Avenue. I walked down Acacia Avenue and there was a car parked outside a house which had stickers all over it which said Bury St Edmunds Ghost Hunters.
Fantastic. Good.
Oh, wow. It just seems unlikely, doesn't it? Caroline says, what's your own best paranormal experience and how did you react?
Well, I wouldn't say it was a best paranormal experience. I've seen one ghost, but I wish I hadn't actually, because it was a crisis apparition. It was in 23rd of January 2011, about 5 o'clock in the morning, and I woke up to see. Well, I wasn't awake. No, I'd actually got up because I was looking after my late father at the time, who was very ill. And I'd got up to help him. I went back to bed, lay on the bed, and suddenly I had a very strong feeling of depression, I suppose. And standing at the end of the bed was the form or the silhouette or the outline of a French lady I had a relationship with about 13 years before. Now, this relationship had actually ended entirely amicably. And there she was at the end of the bed, and it wasn't frightening, but what there was a great feeling of depression and sadness. And after about 30 seconds, I reached for the light because I could kind of see it in profile. I knew it was her, and I switched on the light, and it all kind of pixelated out and disappeared. But the feeling that I was left with stayed with me well into the morning. Now, I'd heard that this lady was unwell. I'd actually thought she was in France, but 2 weeks later, I heard from mutual friends actually abroad that turned out to be the very day that she died. in the Charing Cross Hospital in London. And I had actually, at the time I had this experience, I had actually made a note in my bedside diary and notebook and so on, knowing my psychical research. But as I didn't have the heart to do it, but I got a friend who's a genealogist to apply for the death certificate, and it confirms that she did die on that date in the Charing Cross Hospital at the day I had this experience. Now, I can't say I wanted that experience at all. I'd much rather I hadn't had it, and she was, still alive and everything else. But again, it's nothing unusual in the literature of psychical research. There are hundreds, thousands of similar cases. So that was quite impressive. Couple of experiences I've had, frankly, even now, 20 years on, I struggle to believe I actually witnessed them. So this is the thing where I said at the beginning, it's not that I'm convinced by my own experiences. I mean, on 2 occasions, I believe, possibly 3, I believe I've seen the materialization of biro pens from nowhere. One with another witness at the time. Second, I was by myself about 3 months later, possibly a third one after somebody had died. Frankly, I find it hard to believe that I sort of accept the existence of poltergeist, but I've always been rather skeptical of the one-off poltergeist. But that's happened to me as well.
These are Jots.
Jots, yeah.
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 Mary Rose Barrington's great.
Yeah. So I don't actually class my own experiences as best experiences at all. What convinces me, however, is it's more on the fact they're so similar to other people's reports over the years.
Which takes us on to Dr. Adam Spring. Are there any trends which have emerged from looking at the club's archives, given the period of time the Ghost Club's been in existence since 1862? For example, how technologies have changed the perception of paranormal research and investigation over time. I imagine the longevity of the club puts it in a very interesting position within UK research cultures. Actually, Becky's PhD is largely on that question, so if you want to skip it, feel free. Though she used the SBR, not the Ghost Club. But go on, Ellen, answer it if you can.
Oh well, television has ruined not just psychical research; it's also ruined human experience. And even all this screen-based stuff that we're doing these days is to my mind fundamentally undermining of the human capacity for experience and wonder. I was greatly inspired by Guy Playfair, who long ago had his aerials removed and resolutely lived without television. In fact, wrote a book basically condemning it as a social evil and a form of drug. And I think that is a danger, is absorption into screen-based society, the reception of everything in this way that we're currently dealing with, ultimately is fundamentally undermining the human spirit. I'm not plenty of other people. Ray Bradbury predicted this back in 1952 with his book Fahrenheit 451, with the destruction of the literary culture, which allows the absorption of information into the mind to create its own images, its own imagination, its own ideas, its own treatment. Even just the moment to stop and think, is that right? I think the electromagnetic soup. Well, I mean, I remember nearly 20 years ago walking around Ipswich on my way to the probate office after my grandmother had died, and I looked around, and almost everybody you could see at work in Ipswich. People actually do work in Ipswich, funnily enough, but they do. There they were, all walk, visible through windows, with the exception of cafes and restaurants. Everybody was looking into a screen. And I suddenly thought, if you predicted this as the future in the 1960s, no one predicted that. But everybody is just absorbed in it. I think it does something to human consciousness. It's probably not older generations, such as ourselves, well, at least we remember the world maybe before it. Heaven knows what's coming up next.
Neil Postman wrote a book called Shooting Ourselves to Death in, I think, 1983, which, I mean, I don't own a TV that works. I've got one over there, but it's broken. But I've had 40 years of not having a television. All it means is that I can't hold conversations with people at parties because I've got no idea about Love Island. I don't know what's happening most of the time. If I want to watch television, I have to go next door. Okay, what Becky found was she replicated the 1894 Census of Hallucinations, the SPR, on a smaller scale using the internet to ask the questions, but using a similar approach for her first thing, by which she got collectors to go out and use the same questionnaire. And then she used the same kind of analysis that was used in 1894. And what she discovered was, when you statistically look at the groups that emerged, the patterns in 1894 and the patterns in the modern era are fundamentally identical and bear very little resemblance to popular. So you could use Tyrrell as a guide to what we would actually get in modern ghost hunts, or you could look at Myers and read a case from Myers collected in 1890 and a case that was collected in 2012, and the actual authentic ghost experiences appear to, well, I use that term loosely, but the actual first-hand experiences that are reported bear no resemblance to Hollywood depictions of the paranormal, and have all of the same, exactly the same kind of qualities, which can be proven statistically. So that's interesting. But
yeah, I think that research by Becky is absolutely right. I mean, I remember being asked at the a conference on that dedicate that most useful of subjects, Jeff the Talking Mongoose, 2014, by a Taiwanese journalist who came up and said, well, do you think it's all the media? Is it the media depiction that comes first, or the experience, or is it the experience and then the media? And she was basically suggesting that it was people's experience of the product of the media. To which my reply, which was maybe a bit over the top, but I said, look, the single most watched Hollywood supernatural film in history is The Exorcist. It's one of the top 10 grossing films of all time. And as it was then, in the 43 years, I said, since that film was made, the SBR has not had a single case of projectile green vomiting or a woman masturbating with a crucifix. Absolutely not. We've just not had it. Which was probably a bit over the top as an answer, but yeah, it's to my view, it's nonsense.
So, yeah, let's move on to the next one. Joe Terrell, when was your last investigation, Alan, and have you got any interesting cases you're looking at investigating in the future?
Well, there's lots of historic cases that I'm looking into. After 20 odd years, I've got like a large file. Depends what you count as an investigation, is the other thing. I mean, most of the time, my investigating equipment is a notebook, a pencil, and a sympathetic ear. Really, and there's an awful lot of troubled or people with issues of one thing or another, and what they think what's going on is something psychic or something hugely significant, but it's probably best looked at from another perspective. I mean, I'm really working through what interests me at the moment is the volumes of stuff. I haven't actually done much practical investigation in fresh cases for quite a long time, simply because there is just so much accumulated data from several, a number of cases, which I've accumulated over the years. I started looking seriously at the Battersea Poltergeist in 2014. I still haven't finished. I started looking at the South Shields Poltergeist. I went and inspected their data, looked at the photographs and things in 2009. I can't say I've completed that in terms of it. The Enfield case, my word, I've helped preserve the Enfield stuff is probably the most useful thing I've done. But again, there is just, this is one of the problems. There is just too much data. And I know some psychic research groups and so on get terribly protected about their little case, or you get authors who are obsessed with their. Oh, frankly, there's just too much of it. I've got an archive of Andrew Green's stuff I've never properly studied, which was passed on to me by his widow in 2011. There's enough to keep me busy for the rest of my life, and that's where my focus is now. Is it's trying to look at it, try and make sense of it, detect signals in the noise.
Well, I've just published a 49-page paper on the Cheltenham Ghost 1883 to 1888, and I've got another 2 left coming out on that. So I haven't managed to move out the 19th century on my investigation.
Yeah. I mean, this is the thing. The volume, there's shelves full of this stuff, and one of the problems with spontaneous cases is that what typically happens is that because there's been no really agreed procedure. I mean, parapsychology introduced statistical laboratory approaches from about 1930 onwards, but you can't do that with cases which occur in the wider outside world. And so what's happened is the field has been left to numerous individual researchers, very good people, who each have their own approach and techniques, but then in the natural course of things, they die without leaving any successors. And then you get the next generation growing up again, who start the process all over, have to start it fresh. And if anything, the only thing I hope I've done is been a bridge between some of the older psychic researchers and some of their findings, and to the new generation who are growing up and live in a completely different sort of environment.
Aaron makes a point about witchcraft and apparitions, but we'll come back to that because I'm going to be giving a talk in a few weeks' time, hopefully, at the conference on a very heretical view about the men of science and the witches, looking at Salem and Bury St Edmunds and a number of other witch trials in view of apparitional experience and the investigators thereof. Let's move on to this one. I saw another one down here. Oh, Cameron says he worked briefly in the same building as a bloke who designs smells and licenses them for crayons and things like that. He seemed to make a lot of money from it.
Good.
But if we carry on down, Dave Sivia says if we're talking about ghosts, we need to go back to the medieval idea of spirit as a substance between matter and soul. That takes us to Bertrand Russell's idea of neutral monism, by which there is an underlying stuff that underlies both consciousness and matter, and the two are the same thing, both being expressed differently. That was Bertrand Russell's belief. Robin Bellamy, I'm sorry about that. That's awful, Robin. I hope you're feeling well. Yeah. Ruth Roseweir, here we go. Do you think previously investigators have tended to concentrate on finding one model to explain hauntings, where what is needed is a multi-model approach, taking into account variables of different cases?
Yes, I think a multi-model approach is, and it's interesting. I think there's been a bit. This is just a different take on it. I think there's a very much a division of the sexes in investigation. Because if you watch male investigators at work, they tend to run around with gadgets and love doing recordings and taking measurements, whereas female investigators seem to be a lot more intuitive and a lot more sort of open to sensations and feelings and so on. And I think I'm not a great believer in ghost hunting equipment, except in physical cases, poltergeists, because there you've got things that occur in the material world, leave objective traces and so forth. But anything beyond that, the best detecting device is the human body, or possibly mammals, animals, dogs, cats, and so on. And so I think there's a lot to be said for different approaches, and it was something Maurice Grosse always used to stress. He used to say, I'm not a great believer in theories, I'm much more interested in evidence, and collecting it in a form which can be documented and presentable and so on. But he as an inventor himself, he said, theories will only colour your perception.
Well, thank you ever so much, Alan. Unfortunately, when we come back to cats, we've come to that point in the evening when I have to go and inject my diabetic cat, drink some water, and get ready for work. But thank you so much. What's been an excellent, excellent talk. And there are still a load more questions. So what I'll do is, as always, I'll try and send them over to you so you can have a look through them and read everybody's comments. But it's been over 2 hours and you've been magnificent.
Yeah, it's been over 2 hours. So yeah, well, thank you for putting up with me.
No, what I would like to ask is perhaps you would be able to come back and talk to us again soon, and maybe even we can fit you in at the conference if you've got time. But because it's always such a pleasure, because you have such an incredible amount of knowledge of the subject. So, thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you.
Thanks very much, Alan.
Thank you, everyone.
Hope you're well.
Claire, are you still there, Claire?
Yes, I'm here. Hi.
You want to host for a moment or two, just to see if you can do a couple more questions while I'm, or should we call it a night there? What do you think?
No, that's fine. If you want to, where did we get to?
I'm just going to go back up. Alan, are you free for a few more minutes? Because there are.
Yeah, surely. Yeah, if I can help
Pop
anybody.
down and leave you with Claire. So Claire will now take over.
A pleasure.
We got down as far as Ruth Roseweir, though I've probably missed some. Which was the question we've just asked. So the next question down is Robin Bellamy at 8:37. Can you find that, Claire?
Okay, no worries.
Thanks ever so much. I'll be back in a moment. I'm just going to go and.
Sure.
Okay. Let me see. Bethan Briggs Miller. Do you think there could be a link with the entity between batteries and Enfield?
The link between batteries and Enfield.
I think that might be Battersea.
Battersea. Battersea. Battersea. Well, there were cases of battery failure at Enfield, and so forth. Battersea. Well, what I would say is that you look at the rambling letters that were produced in the Battersea case, and then you look at the ravings of the Enfield Poltergeist voice. There are one or two similarities, it must be said, in terms of foul language, an obsession at various points with popular music. There are similarities, it must be said, and it would make a fascinating study that in terms of the content. And again, if we go back to the infamous Jeff the Talking Mongoose case, that's full of, if true, the ramblings and all kinds of statements. And again, it's one of the things that pops up in the number of these poltergeist cases, an obsession with music. There's a unknown 1948 poltergeist case, briefly mentioned by the Society for Psychical Research, where the poltergeist is demanding a gramophone record to be played. So yeah, there could be something there. Which is it? Well, I mean, one of the ideas is that it's all one arch poltergeist, sort of some evil Lex Luthor villain out there cosmically, or the devil or something, conjuring it all up on Earth. That's been a hypothesis that's been put forward. There are, I think, when you look at when you look at the content of these voices, yes, I think there are similarities.
Thank you, Alan. I don't think you've put anybody's mind at rest with the concept of an arch poltergeist, but Jackie Tonks, are there changes in the types of ghosts recorded by the Ghost Club over the years?
There seem to be less well-defined visual apparitions. This has been a pattern actually picked up by the late Peter Halson, Dr. Peter Halson, from the mid-1980s, that you don't get so many well-witnessed, well-described apparitional figures. What you get is more shadows, more mists, rather vague forms that, even cases seem a bit silly. But equally, that might reflect the social changes in terms of education, people, ability to express themselves in writing, and so forth. It's very hard to get detailed information like you could in the past, simply because I also think people may be losing the art of writing and expressing themselves clearly in words. You know, in a world of text messages and social media, you know, the great arts of expressing oneself, you know, properly in writing may have receded. But yeah, I think that there's certainly things going on. I mean, just a few weeks ago, there was an outbreak of stone throwing, mystery stone throwing, classic poltergeist pattern in Surrey, which, you know, which got into the national news. So these phenomena are certainly occurring, carrying
Just
on.
thinking, Alan, of the, you know, the 17th century. You had the headless ghosts. Then you got these sort of Victorian times, the ghosts with chains. I mean, yeah, that's the sort of cultural changes I was sort of thinking of. So you know, saying basically it's more myths that are reported later on than solid things. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it may be as well. I mean, I've wondered about this in terms of crisis apparitions. Is that maybe we are just so overwhelmed with visual images these days, we can't visualize in the same way that people could in the past. And language itself has changed. I was very lucky many years ago to hear a talk by a man called George Ewart Evans, who was the man who invented oral history. And he spent many years going around East Anglia recording, long before oral history became a recognised subject, recording the speech of farm workers and trawlermen and so on, ditch diggers. And he said that the big change occurred after the First World War, but when you talk to the older generation, they had a much more visual language. They could express things. They would use words, and I can remember my own grandfather sort of talking like this as well. I mean, my grandfather would say that, you know, he wouldn't say it was a dark night. He said it was a night as black hogs. And there was another expression that how long will those apples keep? You wouldn't say, well, those apples will keep for 12 months. The expression was, apples will keep till apples come again. And there was a much more visual quality to people's communication and expression.
It's similar to what CJ was saying about how the brain sees stuff and then it, you know, interprets it and then it hallucinates, adds to it. Could be that we've that ability to sort of, because, you know, we can project images from what we see so onto the retina, and we're you know, when we're in a living room, we don't see the whole of our living room, we hallucinate most of it. And, you know, classic, I got burgled once and I actually saw objects that had been stolen, but I was seeing them still. My brain was, you know, creating them, but they weren't there anymore in reality. It wasn't until my friend pointed out the television wasn't there anymore did I notice, no, the television wasn't there, but I'd actually seen the television. Yeah. It's funny, yeah. So what your brain can do. So it could be that where you said, you know, we've lost that ability to.
And also, according to something I read in New Scientist a couple of years ago, I mean, people's capacity of dreaming is declining. That you know, people get less sleep at night, and their capacity for dreaming is being reduced. And if you make an effort to remember your dreams or write them down, I mean, you know, stuff I dreams are, you know, I write down what I can remember. There's no way I could have thought that up consciously myself. You know, there's all kinds of things that occur in dreams that you could, in your, you know, wildest imaginings as your conscious mind could ever create, but something is creating it.
Thank you.
You know, and putting on a whole play full of, you know, special theatre effects and Hollywood effects and whatever. What on earth is orchestrating that?
Thank you. In what's possibly the worst affront to the Cornish language ever, I'm going to attempt this. Is it Pisky Keon Moore, who wants to know, have you ever interviewed Janet Hodgkinson from the Enfield case? When I saw her doing a rare TV interview about 5 years ago, she still seems traumatized by the events.
Yes, I've not interviewed her myself. I am in touch with somebody who has been interviewing her lately, and your analysis is correct.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's all the questions at the moment, and thank you for staying on to answer them.
Well, that's
And-
all right. Pleasure.
And thank you to everyone who attended and asked questions too. And yeah, hopefully see you all soon.
Well, thank you all very much for listening, and the very best with your own all your own endeavours and researches.
Okay, I am back.
Yeah.
He's back.
He's back. Oh, good.
Right, let's ask 10 more questions then. No, I think people probably want to go now, don't they? But
I think they should.